Good morning, everybody. The first thing that we were asked to do when we were entrusted with this task was to define the concept of entrepreneurship. I'm sorry, but I just don't seem to be able to handle this.
Dunque, vabbè, intanto parlo a braccio. Quindi
Okay, the first objective that we set ourselves was to how to define the entrepreneur within our population. It seems an obvious question, but it's not, because depending on the sort of definition that you give yourselves, the results of your research can be very, very different. On the basis of the data available and the definitions used internationally, we tried to apply two different definitions. The first defines as an entrepreneur anybody who is effectively self-employed, including people who in fact work on a part-time contractual basis. A more restrictive definition is the second, and entrepreneur is described as that person who declares that he or she has an entrepreneurial activity. In other words, coordinates or manages a company, whatever its sector or size. If we then look at our second level graduates of 2008, who have a job 5 years after getting their degree, and you can see that if we look at the first definition, 1 out of 4 degree holders is an autonomous worker. If we adopt the more restrictive definition, the definition that considers those who say they are entrepreneurs proper, only 1% of these graduates are truly entrepreneurs. We are talking about 600 entrepreneurs in just one cohort of graduates, therefore. So I'm going to refer in my presentation to the wider definition of entrepreneur, even if we are going to look at this smaller niche of strict entrepreneurs. Now, how has the entrepreneur cohort developed over the years? Now, to be able to have a wide span, we are going to just look at graduates who are employed after 1 year. You can see there's a tendency to have an increase in autonomous and non-dependent work, even if things haven't changed dramatically despite the crisis. But what we saw from the first year after graduation is the higher percentage of autonomous work in the south. The differences aren't very much, but they become different if you look at the first 5 years after graduation. As you can see, the difference between workers in the south and the north is more than 10%. In fact, this representation is, of course, a histogram, and it just seems to be crossing of two variables. But this was also confirmed by further statistical in-depth analysis that takes into account all the various other variables. So what we are measuring in substance is that all conditions being similar, in the south, there's 50% more likelihood of the graduate being an independent self-employed worker than in the north. So the hypothesis that we put forward was that being self-employed is a sort of refuge and escape route to find a job. Graduates, in fact, meet the difficulties that they especially found in the south, and therefore decide to set up a small business or work on their own. Now, the other difference is the sort of graduate sector. Here we see those study sectors which are most likely to lead to the liberal professions: architecture, legal studies, agriculture, especially veterinary, surgery, psychology, and medicine. So in this study, in fact, we see that these are the sectors of study that are most likely to go into the free professions, and the graduate is likely to be self-employed. With regard to the gender, the difference is quite slight. Despite the variables, men seem to be more likely to become self-employed, and this is especially seen in the first two study areas, architecture and legal studies, and where the gender difference is more marked than for this particular aspect. Perhaps there are different expectations that men and women have when they take these studies, because after finishing university in these particular disciplines, women are more likely and want to find a stable job more than men, perhaps for cultural reasons, and also linked to the desire to have to blend at work and outside work duties. So this has led to a different attitude, slightly different attitude on the behalf of men and women. There are also specific, quite high differences vis-a-vis family background. And this is held to be something which has been surpassed in our country. But AlmaLaurea statistics show that it's still very much with us, and we have seen that in graduates who come from the bourgeoisie, you can see that a higher number more likely to become self-employed, and this becomes half if the graduate, in fact, comes from the working class. So the fact that there is a sort of legacy handed down, we've asked ourselves, because very often the people from the bourgeois classes very often have fathers who are themselves self-employed, and this would seem to be true. In fact, we see fathers here in this table which are very often either entrepreneurs or belonging to the liberal professions, and therefore the graduate is much more likely to go for a similar path. The other aspect is that if we look at the employees among graduates, we see that the professional hierarchy is also respected in the family. We have this breakdown of executives and middle management and so on. Here too, probably the family networks and come into play, and come into play much more, say, than for those who come from a different family background. Now, the differences in the graduates between 1 and 5 years after graduates are quite interesting, because going towards autonomous or self-employed work is something which is seen right after graduation. In fact, if a graduate declares that he is self-employed from the first year of graduation, in 2/3 of the cases, we find him still self-employed at 5 years. Probably because of the economic difficulties. In fact, a certain number, however, have dropped out and do not work as self-employed people as well. And also, if they have got a permanent job, they're very unlikely to have changed it between 1 and 5 years. Also, one could say that this is too short a time span to show up real changes in approach in employment in the graduates. And those at 5 years who said that they were working without a contract, you can see the numbers who have in fact gone into self-employment at 5 years, especially architects. And this is well known. In fact, AlmaLaurea's reports have for some time now shown how how architectural graduates very often start work in architect practices without any contract or a work agreement, and it takes quite a long time for them to get a foot in the door, as it were, and then they tend to go for self-employment. Those that did not work, 22% had in fact found and become self-employed at 5 years. This especially for people with a legal degree. This is quite understandable because they have to have an apprenticeship period in legal studios before they can do this. Now, we see a difference also in the efficacy of the degree. The graduates use what they have learned at university, and being self-employed is usually a self-employment which is in sectors that require this sort of specific degree. And fortunately now earnings, in fact, are lower than average earnings. Perhaps this is because it took them longer to get into the market, and they haven't as yet been able to get on stream, as it were. All this, in fact, is confirmed by each group of discipline, of study discipline. Another aspect of interest was to look at satisfaction in work, in one's work. At 5 years, 3 and 5 years, we asked the graduates to give their score of satisfaction in their job using various parameters. And we have projected all these satisfaction items on a map, and this has pointed up a satisfaction on the job. On the left, we can see stability, earnings, career, prestige, and professionalism. And on the right, we have other aspects which refer to other sorts of satisfaction which go beyond the job: free time, flexibility, independence, social usefulness, and so on. And then we looked at the more material aspects of satisfaction, earnings, stability, and so on, to also less tangible aspects. Now, the satisfaction of autonomous workers is characterized by the lower right quadrant, and they are satisfied, in other words, for factors which are not necessarily linked with the actual job. And in fact, at 5 years, we saw that these sorts of graduates already, before they graduated, indicated that they wanted to be independent, but also use what they had learned at university with their degree. And this, it would appear that they have achieved these satisfaction levels 5 years after graduation. If we look at the single cycle specialist course, the same seems to apply in terms of satisfaction. So up to now, we have seen the definition of entrepreneur in the broadest sense, but as I said before, but we'd also like to give you a few indications, taking the more restrictive definition of self-employed, those 1% who declare that they have a company, for example, at 5 years. Now, the data that we have seen for the broader definition graduates, i.e. they're mostly men, these data are confirmed. And also the study groups. Here it's agricultural graduates, not just veterinary surgery, but agriculture, also economics and statistics. They're highly likely to be independent workers in the South and the islands. And there, too, there is a link between the profession of the father and what the son does. Now, we asked ourselves, is this a case of the graduate taking up the business of the family? It might well be, because in fact we have seen that in this specific definition, in fact, many of the graduates were already working before they graduated, and therefore they probably worked in the family business. And therefore we see that the effectiveness of the degree is less likely to be highly effective and linked in and connected with what the graduate does. But satisfaction is higher than average, so the fact of applying the specific skills used at university does not necessarily seem to be a parameter of satisfaction. Also because the satisfaction levels are high, as you can see, and also compensation and salaries, again, there's not a big difference. And here too, for the broader definition of entrepreneur, here too, they probably after 5 years have not yet got fully on stream. We see a fairly limited effectiveness or efficacy of the degree, as I said before, but great higher satisfaction levels. This especially for graduates in economics. And this is, in fact, of note because business competence, in fact, is something which is handed down or which is given by a degree in economics. Now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Sobrero to continue this. Thank you. We're going to have the lights, and also it's quite warm in here, and so I hope that you won't be falling asleep. But anyway, thank you very much to Andrea Camelli for inviting me here today. And also today, the theme of the meeting is one that we have yet not really looked at in depth, even if AlmaLaurea is 20 years old, i.e. looking at our graduates as the entrepreneurs of the future. And by entrepreneur, I mean somebody who creates jobs very concretely, because if you don't have businesses and entrepreneurs, you're very unlikely to be able to create jobs in a country, because we know that the public administration is highly unlikely to produce jobs in the future. As was underlined by the previous speaker, Silvia, it's very important to talk about this topic, also because we don't have many structured data. And this is a great opportunity because AlmaLaurea has always given the possibility of looking at things from a different point of view, as we've heard from previous presentations. And this lack of data, in fact, is something which we see in other parts of the world. We have just 3 structured presentations looking at what happens to alumni of MIT, Stanford, Tsinghua, Pekin and Tikin in Israel that have presented these sorts of data. And there's no real structured investigation of graduates that then become self-employed or entrepreneurs, and what happens to these companies. So if nobody looks at a topic like this, well, those that actually do will, of course, discover something quite interesting, or interesting things. We have seen that companies which in fact have been founded by MIT, etc., have given 10 million jobs. And you could say, well, why should we bother with U.S. statistics? Because we know we have a completely different economy and it's no use for us here in Italy. The same thing for Tikin, and the same thing you could said for the Tsinghua data as well. Now, let's see what happens in Italy over and above what we have already learned from Silvia, and I'll go back to her conclusions, in my conclusions. If we look at what happens in Italy, as Sandri and Mr. Riccaboni invited us to do today, if we look at this from the point of view of what the university is doing about this, well, I would like to take the opportunity to say that in 2000, almost 14 years ago, in the room next door to us, in fact, there was a first-time meeting of 1,500 students for the launch of the first business plan competition in Bologna. There was one ongoing in Turin also, but since then, in fact, this has become pretty much common practice. There's an institution called PNA Cube, which brings together people to link up graduates and students with the business world. And this initiative has helped to create more than 1,500 jobs and 80 million euros worth of turnover. Not much, but at least a beginning. And I think the university here must help and reinforce the sort of transfer of technology that it should and is able to achieve. So the message is, if you like, that we're not starting from scratch, and that's important, that we mustn't invent the wheel every time. And we should ask, how come the speed of fallout is slower than what we see in other areas and other countries? Perhaps this can be explained from various points of view. Let's take MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Well, here they are launching for the first time what they call a minor, a study course which will be offered to bachelor graduates looking at how to be an entrepreneur. It's entrepreneurship courses. And in our 20 years of study and surveys, we have seen that even if you have a talented graduate, if you don't have the way for this talent to flourish or to be discovered, well, the talent will in fact always remain dormant. When we look at things and places that have done this properly, in fact, we think that we should copy this MIT program. I think we should do it here. And I could ask you, could you imagine a sort of entrepreneur graduate course of all the graduates in all the universities of Italy, and that this could really be brought on stream and get over all the red tape that we have in Italy through the ministries and so on? It is highly unlikely. Unfortunately, we have such little freedom. And in fact, what we want to do is very often stymied. So what we have to do is, in fact, streamline things and pare away things to be able to allow this sort of course to be set up. We, as I say, have put this theme on the table. AlmaLaurea has a plan to further look into this particular aspect of job seeking and providing jobs, and do this from 3 points of view. First of all, encourage our students to develop the talents they have, or even discover that they have these talents in order to create jobs. And that means, in fact, you have to accelerate teaching and accelerate research. And all the companies that we're talking about, in fact, are based on skills and know-how which have been learned within a specific field and in a university field. So if this is not enhanced, of course, the sort of entrepreneurship will not be of good quality. And secondly, it is important to concentrate on enterprises that come and belong to the scientific and technological world. As we have seen, in fact, there are many ways of a person becoming self-employed and also giving jobs to others. And However, not necessarily are these enterprises exclusively technological and scientific. There are many other fields in which self-employment can be fulfilling and give jobs to others as well. If you look at the online research, you can see that individuals who in fact are on these and show up in these research are not necessarily IT people. They just use IT, but they're from a varied series of study areas and fields. And then again, there's the question of public communication on entrepreneurship and being an entrepreneur. Very often we have been accused of the fact that entrepreneurs do not bear the right values, that they're only after profit and they're not socially useful. Well, I think that if this is true, we have to do something about it to change things. So what better way of doing so than to find graduates and a university where they can develop skills which do, in fact, factor in social usefulness. AlmaLaurea, the university, and all the universities of AlmaLaurea underline university training as an important element to be able to get out of the cul-de-sac whereby it is thought and said that a graduate just has to find a job full stop and not look at the possibilities that spread further afield. In fact, we have fewer graduates than we really should have. When the graduates get out of university, they should have had an opening up to this possibility of becoming self-employed, and also that this would entail giving jobs to others. So what we hope to is to be able to really take up this project and forge ahead with it. We have launched this research project, which will take some time and will allow us to collect data on entrepreneurs and on the jobs which entrepreneurs coming out of the universities have been able to create.